The recruits laughed at her shaky push-ups. It was a low sound, a ripple of snickering that the gravelly voice of the drill sergeant easily smothered. But Sergeant Elara Vance felt it more than she heard it. Each tremor in her arms, a betrayal of muscle memory, seemed to amplify their derision. She kept her eyes fixed on a gray pebble embedded in the dusty training yard of Forward Operating Base Kestrel. The pebble was her world. It did not judge. It did not remember a time when she could do 100 of these without breaking a sweat, when her body was a seamless extension of her will. Now there was a disconnect, a static hiss between intent and action. This was her first physical training session with the infantry unit, a mandatory reacclimation after a year spent in what her file blandly called logistical support. The young men around her, their chests puffed with the unscarred confidence of their early 20s, powered through their repetitions with grunts of theatrical effort. They saw a woman nearing 30, with tired lines around her eyes and a tremor in her arms that bespoke weakness. They saw a problem, a liability. Elara saw only the pebble and the next breath. Inhale as she lowered her chest, the coarse fabric of her uniform scraping the ground. Exhale as she pushed the earth away, her triceps screaming in protest, her shoulders sending a familiar, sharp signal of complaint. The laughter had faded, replaced by the rhythmic counting of Sergeant Gunther, a man whose neck was as thick as her thigh. 31. 32. Are we tired, ladies? His gaze swept over the recruits, but lingered on her, a glint of predatory satisfaction in his eyes. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed watching the new transfer struggle. He saw what the others saw, a soldier who didn't belong. He didn't see the network of pale, silvery scars hidden beneath her uniform, a roadmap of a single, catastrophic night. He didn't feel the phantom ache of shrapnel that had been meticulously picked from her back. He only saw the shake. Elara closed her eyes for a second, blocking out the rising sun that baked the arid landscape. The pain was a tool. It was a reminder. She had survived worse than the scorn of boys and the burn in her muscles. She had survived silence and cold and the certainty of her own death. This was nothing. This was just gravity. She opened her eyes. The pebble was still there. 48. 49. 50. Gunther called the end of the set. Around her, bodies collapsed onto the ground with groans of relief. Muscled arms gave way. Young soldiers gasped for air. Elara finished her 50th push-up, the tremor in her arms now a violent shudder. She held the up position for a single defiant beat, her entire body a taut wire of agony and control. Then, she lowered herself slowly, deliberately to the ground. She had not broken. She had not quit. She had simply finished. As she rolled onto her back, the vast, empty blue of the desert sky filling her vision, she heard one of the recruits, a corporal named Miller, speak to his friend. "Did you see that? I thought she was going to snap in half." The friend chuckled. "Admin clerk trying to play with the grunts. She won't last a week." Elara said nothing. She just breathed, matching her rhythm to the slow, patient pulse of the earth beneath her. They were wrong. She would last. She had already outlasted so much more. A summons came an hour later. "Colonel Bishop wants to see you." Elara followed the runner to the Tactical Operations Center, a climate-controlled box that hummed with the low thrum of servers and quiet tension. The air inside was cold, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. Colonel Bishop was a man who looked like he had been carved from granite and left out in the sun too long. He sat behind a large metal desk, a stack of files to his left, a single, thin folder directly in front of him. Her folder. He didn't invite her to sit. He gestured to the folder with a dismissive flick of his fingers. "Sergeant Vance, your file is sparse." Elara stood at attention, her gaze fixed on the wall behind his head, on a map of the hostile territory that surrounded them. "It's all there, sir." "Is it?" Bishop leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. "It says you spent the last 12 months at the Rhine-Main Medical Annex assignment. Logistical support. Before that, a string of postings so heavily redacted they might as well be blank. Now, you've been transferred here to a forward operating base in an active combat zone, with a recommendation for field duty. He picked up a single sheet of paper from her file. Your physical evaluation scores are borderline. You barely passed the run. Your strength metrics are significantly below infantry standard. Sergeant Gunther's report from this morning's PT was not glowing. He used the word frail. The word hung in the sterile air, an insult wrapped in military jargon. Frail. Alara's jaw tightened, but her expression remained impassive. She had been called many things in her career: ghost, specter, reaper, but never frail. With all due respect, sir, my performance is adequate. I am fit for duty. Bishop's eyes, pale and skeptical, finally met hers. He was searching for something. A lie, a weakness, a reason to send her back to whatever quiet corner of the military she had crawled out of. He saw only a calm, steady gaze. Adequacy isn't the standard here, Sergeant. I need to know the soldier to my left and my right is 100%. My people operate in high-stress, high-risk environments. They carry heavy loads over long distances. They engage the enemy. They can't be carrying you. His tone was not cruel, merely pragmatic. He was a commander responsible for lives, and she was an unknown variable, an equation that didn't add up. The redacted file, the medical posting, the poor PT scores, it painted a picture of someone being quietly pushed out to pasture, and he was being asked to be the pasture. I will not be a liability, Colonel. Her voice was quiet, but it held a core of unyielding certainty. It was the same voice that had whispered coordinates into a radio as her own blood pooled around her. It was the only part of her that felt entirely unbroken. The colonel sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He was a man of rules and regulations, of clear chains of command and predictable outcomes. She was an anomaly. Look, Sergeant, I can't send you back without cause. But I can't, in good conscience, assign you to a line unit. Not yet. He made a decision, tapping his pen on his desk. You're assigned to tower duty. 6-hour shifts, starting at 0600 tomorrow. You will observe, you will report, and you will stay out of the way. We'll reevaluate in 30 days. Maybe the desk life made you soft. Maybe you can work your way back. We'll see. It was a dismissal, a punishment for a crime she hadn't committed. He was putting her on a shelf, hoping she would collect enough dust to be forgotten. Understood, sir. That's all, Sergeant. Dismissed. Alara executed a sharp about-face and walked out of the frigid office, back into the blistering heat. Tower duty. A glorified scarecrow. She felt a cold anger settle in her stomach. They thought her body was weak. They had no idea. The weakness was a cage, but inside it, something far more dangerous was pacing, waiting, and watching. The watchtower became her sanctuary. Perched 30 feet above the baked earth, it offered a panoramic view of the base and the desolate landscape beyond. To the west, jagged mountains clawed at the sky. To the east, an endless expanse of sand and rock shimmered under the relentless sun. Down below, FOB Kestrel was a self-contained world of HESCO barriers, tents, and prefabricated buildings. A tiny island of order in a sea of chaos. Life hummed along its predictable, regulated patterns. Alara watched it all. She wasn't just standing a post. She was studying. This was her true element. Not the brute force of a push-up, but the intricate geometry of a battlefield. Her mind, honed by years of operating in the shadows, began to dissect the base's defenses. She noted the blind spot created by the shadow of the comms array in the late afternoon. She traced the patrol routes of the perimeter guards, identifying their routines, their habits, the way they bunched up near the south gate for a shared cigarette. She saw how the placement of 2 generators created a noise corridor that could mask the sound of an approaching vehicle. She wasn't seeing a base. She was seeing a target. She spent hours mentally running drills, her gaze distant. An attack from the North Ridge. How would it unfold? They'd use the morning sun for glare, suppress the towers with heavy machine guns, and send sappers to breach the wire at its weakest point, right behind the mess hall. A complex ambush on a departing convoy. Where would they place the IED? Not on the main road, that was too obvious. They'd hit the secondary vehicle on the curve 2 clicks out, where the wadi provided natural cover for the triggerman. She rehearsed her responses, her escape routes, her fields of fire. Her body may have been a reluctant partner, but her mind was a finely tuned weapon, and here, in the quiet solitude of the tower, she could sharpen it. Corporal Miller, the one who had laughed, was often assigned to the detail that brought supplies and water to the tower guards. The first few times, he was all business, dropping the water bottles and leaving without a word. He was still embarrassed, or perhaps intimidated, but on the third day he lingered. "Quiet up here," he offered, squinting out at the horizon. "It is," Elara replied, not taking her eyes off the distant heat haze. "Must be boring." "Boredom is a luxury," her answer was flat, devoid of emotion, yet it made him pause. He followed her gaze, trying to see what she saw. He saw nothing but empty desert. "What are you looking for, anyway?" "The thing you don't expect." She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, and they seemed to see right through his youthful bravado. "See that ridge line? The one that looks like a sleeping dragon." She pointed. "Standard doctrine says it's too far for effective small arms fire, too exposed for a mortar team. So we don't watch it as closely. We watch the wadis, the roads. But a patient sniper with a high-caliber rifle could spend a week up there, just learning our rhythms, waiting for a target of opportunity. Like a colonel walking from the TOC to the mess hall at the same time every day, Miller stared at the ridge, a sudden chill running down his spine despite the 100-degree heat. He had never once thought of it as a threat. It was just part of the scenery. "You think about that a lot?" "I think about everything a lot," she said, turning back to her surveillance. "It's the job." Miller left without another word. The next day, he brought her an extra canteen of water. He didn't say why. He just set it down and left. The laughter had stopped. In its place, a seed of uncertain curiosity had been planted. He was starting to suspect, as Elara already knew, that the tower wasn't her prison. It was her throne. The pressure began as a whisper, a change in the wind. Elara felt it on her skin before she saw it on the horizon. The sky to the west was turning a sickly shade of yellow-brown. A sandstorm, not a small squall, but a full-blown haboob, a rolling wall of dust and fury. On the radio, the alert went out, a clipped, professional voice advising all personnel to secure equipment and seek shelter. Below, the base sprang into a frenzy of activity. Soldiers rushed to tie down tarps and secure loose gear. The hum of the base changed, becoming more urgent, more frantic. From her perch, Elara watched the storm devour the landscape. The distant mountains vanished first, then the horizon itself, consumed by the roiling cloud. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that grew in intensity with every passing second. Then the comms crackled. A burst of static, a garbled voice from a patrol out on reconnaissance, then silence. The channel went dead. Elara tried her own handset. Nothing. She switched to the base-wide channel. More silence. In the TOC, she knew chaos would be taking root. A storm like this was a disorienting nightmare. To lose communications at the same time was a crisis. Colonel Bishop would be shouting orders, but he would be shouting into a void. His eyes and ears on the outside world were gone. The recruits on the perimeter would be feeling the pressure most. The world had shrunk to a few feet of churning brown dust. Every shadow was a threat, every gust of wind a potential footstep. Fear was a contagion, and in these conditions it would spread like wildfire. But Elara felt no fear. She felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. This was a familiar state. The sudden absence of information, the sensory deprivation, the rising tension. It was the prelude to violence. She had lived in this state for weeks at a time. The pressure didn't constrict her. It sharpened her senses. She closed her eyes, letting the roar of the wind wash over her. She focused on the other sounds. The rhythmic flapping of a loose strap on a tent below. The high-pitched whine of the wind whipping around the comms tower. And something else. A new sound, almost lost in the gale. A faint, metallic clink. It was rhythmic, unnatural. It wasn't the storm. She opened her eyes. Visibility was less than 20 feet. The world was a maelstrom of sand. But her mind was clear. She knew what that sound was. It was the sound of wire cutters. Someone was at the fence. The storm was a cover. The comms failure wasn't an accident. They were being tested, probed. The pressure was on, and the base was blind, deaf, and breaking down. For everyone else, this was a disaster. For Alara, it was simply the beginning of the problem. And she was already working on the solution. She had a choice. A simple one with monumental consequences. Her orders were to stay put, to observe and report. But the radio was dead, and there was nothing to observe but a wall of sand. To obey would be to do nothing, to let the threat at the wire develop, to trust that someone else would handle it. It was the safe choice, the one that would keep her out of trouble. Her other option was to act. To break protocol, leave her post, and move toward the danger she had detected. It was the choice of a soldier, not a clerk. It was the only choice she could make. Alara slung her rifle over her shoulder and began her descent down the tower's metal ladder. The wind tore at her, trying to rip her from her perch. Each step was deliberate. On the ground, the storm was a physical force, a sand-blasting torrent that stung her exposed skin and made breathing difficult. She pulled her goggles down and wrapped the lower half of her face with a shamrock. She moved not with speed, but with a fluid economy of motion that was utterly at odds with the woman who had struggled with push-ups. She flowed through the chaos of the base, a gray shape in the brown gloom. She didn't run. Running was noisy and exhausting. She used the storm as her cover, moving from one piece of shelter to the next, her footsteps swallowed by the gale. She headed for the southern perimeter, toward the weak point behind the mess hall she had identified days ago. The metallic clinking had stopped, but she knew where they would be. As she neared the fence line, she saw them. A small group of recruits huddled behind a stack of sandbags. Corporal Miller was among them, his young face pale with fear, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. Their sergeant was yelling, but his words were lost to the wind. They were panicked, disorganized, their attention focused everywhere and nowhere at once. A few yards away, a section of the concertina wire had been cut and pulled back. Clean, professional breach. Alara didn't shout. Shouting was for people who had lost control. She appeared beside them like an apparition, her sudden presence a shock. She put a hand on the sergeant's shoulder. He flinched, spinning around, rifle raised. He lowered it when he saw her. "Vance? What the hell are you doing here? Get back to your post." Alara ignored him. Her voice was low and calm, yet it cut through the roar of the storm and the haze of their fear. "Miller," she said, her gaze locking onto the young corporal. "You have a thermal scope. Scan 200 meters out, Sector 4, along that ditch." The order was so specific, so confident, it bypassed his panic. He fumbled for a moment, then raised his rifle, peering through the optic. "Jones," she said to another soldier. "That vehicle chassis 20 meters from the breach. Set a small charge on the front axle." On my signal to the third Martinez, she simply said, "With me." Suppressing fire. 3-round bursts. Aim for the sounds. They obeyed without question. The terrified recruits were gone, replaced by soldiers with a purpose. She had given them a plan, and it was an anchor in the storm. She crept forward with Martinez to the edge of the breach. She didn't look through a scope. She just listened. The wind carried the scent of wet canvas and foreign tobacco. And then, a cough, quickly stifled. Alara raised her hand. A simple gesture. 200 meters out, Miller saw a cluster of heat signatures bloom in his thermal scope. Contact. 6. No, 8 of them in the ditch. At the same moment, Alara gave the signal. The charge on the vehicle chassis detonated with a sharp crack. Not a large explosion, but bright and loud. For a split second, every enemy eye would be drawn to the flash. In that second, Alara and Martinez opened fire. Their shots were not a panic spray, but a controlled, precise volley. They weren't aiming for kills. They were aiming to disrupt. The enemy probe, expecting a sleeping, blinded base, had walked into a coordinated response. Return fire erupted from the ditch, wild and inaccurate. But Alara was already moving, pulling her small team back into deeper cover. The intervention had lasted less than 30 seconds. It was efficient, brutal, and perfectly executed. The enemy was confused, their element of surprise gone. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Alara knelt, calmly reloading her magazine, the storm still raging around her. The recruits stared at her, their fear replaced by a profound, shell-shocked awe. The storm began to recede as quickly as it had arrived. The wind lessened its howl, and the thick brown curtain of dust thinned to a hazy veil. The first thing Miller saw clearly was Sergeant Vance. She was kneeling by the breach, her rifle held in a low-ready position, her head cocked as if she were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Then he looked at the aftermath. 2 enemy bodies lay sprawled near the fence line, caught in the initial volley of fire. Beyond them, in the ditch, drag marks in the sand indicated where the others had pulled back their wounded and retreated. It was a clean engagement. There were no friendly casualties. The perimeter was secure. Miller looked at his own squad. Their initial panic was gone, replaced by the lingering buzz of adrenaline and a new, unsettling awareness. The woman they had laughed at, the one they had dismissed as a paper pusher, had just saved their lives. She had moved with a purpose and clarity that their own NCO had lacked. Her commands had been precise, her actions decisive. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. Nothing about her suggested the physical weakness they had witnessed that morning. It was like watching 2 completely different people. Word of the repelled probe at the south fence spread quickly as the comms flickered back to life. It wasn't long before Colonel Bishop arrived, his face a grim mask of dust and stress. He surveyed the scene. The cut wire, the enemy casualties, the shaken but unharmed recruits. His eyes betrayed his surprise. He had expected to find a disaster. Instead, he found a textbook defensive action. He walked over to Miller's squad sergeant, who was still trying to process what had happened. "Report," Bishop commanded. The sergeant stammered through his explanation. "The storm hit, comms went down. We saw the wire was cut. They opened fire from that ditch." He conveniently left out their own panic and confusion. Bishop's gaze sharpened. "You repelled an 8-man probe with no casualties? How?" The sergeant hesitated, then gestured with his chin toward Alara. "It was her, sir. Sergeant Vance. She showed up out of nowhere, organized us, set up a crossfire. She knew where they were going to be." Bishop turned his head and looked at Alara. She was still in the same position, methodically checking her equipment, her focus absolute. She didn't look at him. She didn't seem to care that the colonel of the base was standing 10 feet away. There was no pride in her posture, no hint of an "I told you so" attitude. She was simply a soldier who had completed a task and was preparing for the next one. The colonel walked over to her. "Sergeant, you were ordered to remain in your post." "The radio was down, sir," Alara stated, finally looking up at him. Her gray eyes were calm, unreadable. "I couldn't report. I heard them at the wire. I acted on the available intelligence." "You left your post and engaged the enemy without orders." It was an accusation, but it lacked heat. It was a statement of fact from a man whose entire worldview was being shaken. "My orders were to observe and report threats to this base, sir. I observed a threat. When I was unable to report, I neutralized it." Her logic was flawless, her tone respectful but unyielding. Bishop stared at her, the pieces not fitting together. The frail woman from the PT yard, the quiet observer from the tower, the ruthlessly efficient tactician who had just orchestrated a perfect defense. He thought of her file, the blacked-out lines, the cryptic posting at a medical facility. The dismissal in his eyes was gone, completely replaced by a deep, unsettling curiosity. He was beginning to realize he had made a serious, fundamental miscalculation. He hadn't been sidelining a liability. He had been benching his most valuable player. The base was on high alert. The repelled probe confirmed everyone's worst fears. The storm and the comms failure had been deliberate, a prelude to a larger, coordinated assault. The Tactical Operations Center, which had been a hub of confused panic an hour ago, was now humming with tense, focused energy. Soldiers relayed reports, Analysts frantically tried to get satellite imagery through the lingering atmospheric dust, and officers huddled over maps, trying to predict the enemy's next move. Colonel Bishop stood at the center of it all, a deep frown etched on his face. The enemy was still out there, and he was still half blind. He felt the weight of every life on the base resting on his shoulders. He looked up and saw Sergeant Vance enter the TOC, escorted by a runner. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown at the perimeter, her eyes scanning the room, absorbing every detail. The other officers gave her a wide berth, whispering among themselves. She was no longer just the new transfer. She was the ghost who had appeared in the storm. Bishop made a decision that went against every instinct in his by-the-book mind. He waved her forward. "Sergeant," he said, his voice loud enough for the other officers to hear. The room quieted slightly. "Give me your assessment." A few of the staff officers exchanged skeptical glances. Asking a sergeant, a tower guard, for a strategic assessment in front of the entire command staff was unheard of. Elara stepped up to the main tactical map, a large holographic display of the base and the surrounding terrain. She didn't seem intimidated by the audience of majors and captains. She studied the map for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she began to speak, her voice steady and clear. The probe at the south fence was a feint. Too small, too cautious. They weren't trying to breach. They were trying to gauge our response time and readiness in adverse conditions. She tapped a finger on the map, indicating the area of the first contact. They were also testing our command structure. They wanted to see if we'd panic, if we'd empty our reserves chasing a ghost. She then moved her finger to the west, to a deep, jagged ravine that cut through the foothills of the mountains. The area was marked in red on the map, indicating terrain deemed impassable for a large, organized force. Standard intelligence suggests the main assault will come from the north or the east, using the main supply routes for a rapid advance. That's what they want us to think. Her finger rested on the ravine. This is where they'll come from. They'll use the cover of the ravine to get their main force within striking distance of our western wall, bypassing our primary sensor grid. They think we see this as an obstacle. They're using it as a highway. A major spoke up, his tone laced with condescension. "Sergeant, with all due respect, our drones have mapped that ravine. It's a bottleneck, a natural kill zone. No competent commander would send his main force through there." Elara turned her gaze to the major. "A competent commander wouldn't, but a clever one would. He knows what our doctrine says. He knows we think it's a bottleneck. He's counting on our arrogance. He's using our own rulebook against us." Her confidence was absolute. She wasn't guessing. She was stating a fact. She had seen something in the initial probe, the way they retreated, the discipline they showed, that had given her an insight into their commander's mind. Colonel Bishop stared at the map, then at Elara. His entire staff, his intelligence reports, his own extensive experience all pointed to an attack from the north. But this sergeant, this enigma, was telling him they were all wrong. He was at a crossroads. Trust decades of established military doctrine, or trust the gut instinct of a soldier he had dismissed as frail less than 12 hours ago. The lives of everyone on the base hung on his decision. He looked at Elara, at the unshakable certainty in her eyes. It was a bigger gamble than he had ever taken. "All right," Bishop said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. He turned to his executive officer. "Major, divert Delta Company. I want every heavy weapon we have moved to the western perimeter, overlooking that ravine. Set up a kill box. I want interlocking fields of fire covering every inch of it." Then he turned back to Elara, his expression grim. "I'm holding you personally responsible for this, Sergeant. Pray to God you're right." The night was unnaturally quiet after the storm had passed. The air was clean, and the sky was filled with a cold scattering of stars. Every soldier on the western perimeter was tense, their weapons trained on the silent, black maw of the ravine. They were there on the word of a sergeant most of them didn't know, aiming their guns at a patch of empty rock while their instincts screamed that the real threat was elsewhere. Doubt was a palpable thing, a cold murmur that passed between the men in the fighting positions. This felt wrong. felt like a fool's errand. Alara stood in a makeshift command post with Corporal Miller and his team, overlooking the kill zone. She wasn't looking at the ravine itself. She was watching the rocks on the far ridge, watching for the glint of an observer's scope. She knew the enemy commander would want to see his plan unfold. The attack, when it came, was not a thunderous assault. It began with a series of coordinated explosions from the north and east, diversions. Mortar rounds and RPGs slammed into the empty bunkers and decoy positions Bishop had left there, exactly where the enemy expected the main force to be. The radio channels erupted with frantic, phantom reports of massed troops. It was a well-orchestrated piece of theater. In the TOC, Bishop's staff were panicking. "Sir, we have a major assault on the north gate." But the colonel's eyes were glued to the drone feed from the western ravine. It was still empty. He held his nerve. "All units, hold your positions. Do not move." It was the longest 10 minutes of his life. Then, on the thermal feed, the first signature appeared. A single scout, emerging from the ravine. Then another. Then 10. Then 50. An entire company was pouring out of the darkness, moving swiftly and silently toward the supposedly undefended western wall. They had taken the bait. "Light them up," Bishop said, his voice cold as ice. The night exploded. Heavy machine guns, grenade launchers, and mortar rounds rained down into the ravine. The enemy, caught in the open in a perfectly prepared kill box, was annihilated. The battle was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. During a lull in the fighting, as the last pockets of resistance were being mopped up, an older master sergeant, a comms technician named Elias Thorne, made his way to the TOC. He had just wrestled a high-bandwidth satellite link back online. His face was pale. He approached Colonel Bishop, who was watching the drone feed with a look of grim satisfaction. "Sir," Thorne said, his voice a hushed, reverent whisper. "You need to see this." He handed the colonel a tablet displaying a personnel file he had just pulled from the central command server. It was Alara's file, but this one wasn't redacted. It was the original. Bishop read the name, Sergeant Alara Vance, and below it a single line, callsign Spectre. He looked up at Thorne, confused. "What is this?" "Sir, I was stationed at Command Sector Gamma 5 years ago," Thorne explained, his voice trembling slightly. "During Operation Nightfall, we monitored the whole thing. It was a deep infiltration mission, a 5-person team sent to take out a high-value target. The mission went sideways. They were compromised, surrounded 100-to-1 odds. We listened for 3 days as they were hunted. We heard the callsign Spectre coordinating the defense until the very end. The official report said there were no survivors." Thorne pointed a shaky finger at the live drone feed on the main screen. It showed a small figure moving along the perimeter, calmly directing a fire team. "It was Alara. Sir, that's her. That's Spectre, the sole survivor of Nightfall. We all thought she was a ghost story. We thought she was dead." Colonel Bishop looked from the tablet to Thorne's awestruck face, and then to the screen. He watched the woman he had sent to a watchtower move with the lethal grace of a predator. The medical transfer, the impossible prediction, the shaky push-ups. It all slammed into place. The tremors in her arms weren't from weakness or fear. They were the last lingering ghosts of a battle no one else could have survived. He hadn't just misjudged a soldier. He had dismissed a legend. The sun rose on a scene of quiet devastation. The fighting was over. The base was secure. A thin veil of smoke hung in the air, tasting of cordite and diesel. Along the western perimeter, soldiers were collecting enemy weapons and tending to the few friendly wounded. The sense of relief was thick enough to touch. Alara sat alone, away from the others, near the edge of the ravine. Her back was against a sandbag, her rifle disassembled on a canvas cloth in front of her. She was methodically, almost meditatively, cleaning each component. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the familiar deep ache in her bones and the sharp, nagging pain in her shoulder. She felt a presence and looked up. Corporal Miller stood there, along with the rest of his squad. They weren't smiling. They weren't speaking. They just stood in a loose semicircle, their expressions a mixture of awe, gratitude, and something else. A profound, wordless respect. Miller, the boy who had snickered at her push-ups a day earlier, gave her a short, sharp nod. It was a gesture that acknowledged everything. The laughter, the fear in the storm, the calm in the firefight. It was an apology and a thank you all in one. One by one, the other soldiers in the squad followed his lead, nodding to her before they turned and walked away, leaving her to her solitude. The message was clear. They understood now. A few minutes later, another set of boots appeared on the gravel beside her. These were polished. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. She began to reassemble her rifle, her movements precise and economical. "At ease, Sergeant," Colonel Bishop said. His voice was different. The hard, dismissive edge was gone, replaced by a tone of quiet gravity. Alara continued her work, her hands moving with practiced familiarity. She started to push herself to her feet, to come to proper attention for a commanding officer. Bishop put a hand on her good shoulder, gently but firmly stopping her. "As you were," she paused, looking up at him. The skepticism in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, searching respect. He saw her now, not as a name on a file or a struggling soldier in a PT yard, but as the sum of her actions. He saw the warrior she had kept hidden. He took a step back, drew himself up to his full height, and rendered a slow, formal salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture an officer gives a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier acknowledging a peer, a sign of ultimate professional respect, offered in full view of his command staff, who had followed him out onto the perimeter. He held the salute, his eyes locked on hers. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of the lives she had saved. Then, his voice dropping slightly, he added the name he had read in the file, the name whispered in hushed tones by old comms techs. Spectre Alara didn't salute back. She simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of her head. It was all the acknowledgement he needed. The gesture said, "I did my duty." Nothing more needed to be said. He dropped his salute and walked away, leaving her once more with the rising sun and the silence of the desert. Weeks turned into a month. The memory of the assault faded, replaced by the grinding routine of life on a forward operating base. The breach in the fence was repaired, the scorch marks were swept away by the wind, and the stories of the battle began to take on the quality of legend. But some things had changed permanently. Sergeant Alara Vance was no longer on tower duty. At her own request, she remained with the same infantry unit, tasked with training the recruits. She had been offered a position on the colonel's staff, a role in tactical planning, but she had politely declined. She belonged with the grunts on the line. This morning, she was leading them in physical training. The sun was just beginning to crest the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "On the ground," she commanded. Her voice was the same as it always was, quiet, calm, but with an authority no one dared to question. "Push-ups. On my count. Begin." 100 soldiers dropped into position. Alara got down with them, her hands placed shoulder-width apart in the familiar dusty gravel. She began to count, her voice a steady rhythm against the sound of strained breathing. 1, 2, 3 she moved with them, lowering her chest to the ground and pushing the earth away. The tremor was still there, a slight, persistent shudder in her triceps, a ghostly echo of the nerve damage that would never fully heal. It was a visible imperfection, a crack in the armor. But this time no one laughed, no one snickered. The yard was filled with a focused, respectful silence. The recruits, especially Miller and his squad, watched her. They weren't looking for weakness anymore. They were watching the embodiment of strength. They saw the tremor not as a flaw, but as a testament to what she had endured. It was a badge of honor she wore in her very muscles. One by one, the younger, stronger soldiers began to falter. Their arms gave out, their form broke. They dropped to their knees, gasping, their muscles screaming for release. The drill sergeant, Gunther, who now watched from the sidelines with a look of quiet deference, was among the first to stop. Miller pushed himself harder than he ever had before, determined to keep up. He managed another 10 after most had quit, his vision tunneling, his body shaking violently, before he finally collapsed with a groan. Soon, only one person was left. Alara continued, her pace steady, her form unwavering except for that slight, constant tremor. She pushed past 50, then 60, then 70. She was alone, a single figure rising and falling with a relentless, metronomic rhythm. She wasn't competing with them. She was competing with the ghosts of her past, with the limits of her own broken body. Each repetition was a small victory, a reclamation of herself. She finished her final push-up, held it for a beat, and then rose gracefully to her feet. She dusted off her hands and stood, facing her exhausted unit. She looked out over their heads, toward the vast, silent horizon. The name on her uniform tape read Vance, a simple, anonymous label, but her presence filled the training yard. She was no longer the woman with the shaky push-ups. She was their standard. She was proof that the truest strength wasn't about perfect form or brute power. It was about the will to push forward when everything inside you is screaming to stop. It was about enduring. Her quiet dignity was its own monument, a silent testament to a victory won not on a battlefield, but in the heart of a soldier who had refused to be broken.